Hello, AP Euro, and welcome to our first virtual lecture. I hope you guys are all taking care of yourselves, taking care of your families, trying to stay sane in this, kind of weird new reality. At least that's what I'm trying to do. So welcome to our first virtual lecture. Today we are covering the Cold War. You will want to be taking notes, so if you don't already have your notebook out, now would be a good time to pause this video, go and grab your notebook, because there will be a lecture quiz to check in and make sure that you are picking up the main concepts, you're listening and paying close attention. I'm going to split this lecture into probably 2 different videos, just to give myself a break and also to give you breaks. So let's get going here. So by now you should have started the Chapter 28 packet, and definitely you should have read Chapter 28 by now. So shout out to Miles, Dylan, Rika, Stanley, Alex, Akil, Jaita, Asia, Vivi, and Sherry. I can see on Google Classroom that you are working on your Chapter 28 packets, and everybody else, I see you. I see you on Google Classroom not working on your work. So please get going on that so that you can keep up with our content. So by now you should know that the Cold War is the time between 1945 and 1991. It's this period where there's like really intense competition and rivalry and tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. So during this time, we're going to see a lot go down. There's the arms race, the space race. There's a lot of spying and espionage. There are a ton of proxy wars that are being fought, but throughout the whole period, at no point does the United States actually fight the Soviet Union. So even though it's called like a war, it's called the Cold War for that reason, because the United States and Soviet Union never actually had a declaration of war between the two, because we never actually fought them. But what we do see a lot of are, like I said, the proxy wars, which means essentially like our people fight their people, our allies fight their allies, or we fight their allies, or their allies fight us, or some kind of combination of that. So today, you have a couple things going on other than listening to this lecture. On Google Classroom, I posted this morning the video and the discussion questions for this. So this is, just more of a casual discussion, not like Socratic seminar discussion. But I do want you to watch this video. It's very funny. It's very weird. It's a Soviet propaganda film from 1963. And there are discussion questions for you to respond to on Google Classroom, and then for you to respond to your peers to sort of engage in conversation with them. All the directions are up on Google Classroom, as well as a link to the video, so please check that out if you have not already. So we have to have a basic understanding of like why the United States and the Soviet Union are so at odds with each other, and the basic thing you need to know is that we are at odds with them because we have very different ideas and very different practices than they do. In the United States, we have a capitalist system, so people have the ability to own private property. Consumers have the freedom of choice, right? You can go out and you have choice about what you want to buy and how much of it you want to buy. And we have a free market system, whereas in the Soviet Union, because it is a communist country, they don't have any of that. They have a centrally planned economy, meaning the government plans it, the government controls most of the industries, and then the government also distributes the wealth. So they distribute consumer goods, or they distribute incomes to the workers. But that's only one part of it. So I don't want you to think that the Cold War is only being fought because we don't like their economic system, or because we believe, free trade is really important, or that, private property is really important. The other sort of thing that's going on here is the political ideology and the differences between those. The United States is a democracy. We have a system where we can elect our leaders. and elect people to represent us. We have a lot of freedoms and liberties that are guaranteed by law. So like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to a fair trial, stuff like that. Whereas in the Soviet Union, we know that they have a totalitarian system. We know that Joseph Stalin's in charge, and there's like no way around that. You can't vote him out. You can't vote somebody else in. In the Soviet Union, the only political party allowed is the Communist Party, so you don't even have political choice. And we know that people in the Soviet Union have very like unfree lives. They don't have freedom of speech. They don't have freedom of the press. The government controls all the media. There's no, fair trial. If Stalin doesn't like you, you're getting purged, or so you're getting killed, or you're getting sent to the gulag. So it's a very different system. And so those are kind of the things that are going on. But the other thing here is like the United States and the Soviet Union have always been at odds. I mean, from the moment the Soviet Union was established in 1922, the United States was not about that life. The U.S. did not support the Bolshevik Revolution when that was taking place. The United States was not in support of a communist takeover. So then the question really becomes, well, why did the Cold War start in 1945? Why didn't it start earlier if we've always been at odds with the Soviet Union? And the answer really has a lot to do with World War II. And so we'll talk through a couple of these things. So one reason why the Cold War started when it did is because it basically starts the moment that World War II ends. The United States and the Soviet Union had been at odds with each other for a long time. But when World War II begins, it was like we had to set aside our differences and work together to fight against the greater evil. We had to fight against Hitler and Mussolini and Japan. And so we overlook some of our issues with them. But those issues are going to become painfully clear when the war starts to wind down, especially. One of the sort of factors that contributes to distrust and tension between the United States and the Soviet Union towards the end of World War II is sort of who's doing what. So we know that during World War II, the Soviet Union really did a lot of the fighting and a lot of the dying on the Eastern Front of the war. And so from the Soviet perspective, it felt unfair that they should have taken on so much of this burden, especially because they had been interested in having the United States particularly open up a second front in Europe. So remember, when we studied World War II, we talked about how the United States had essentially, once they had gotten involved in the war, their first place that we had sent American troops was actually in the European theater, at least, was North Africa. We didn't go right for Europe right away because we felt like that wasn't a good strategy. Well, for Stalin and for the Soviet Union, this felt like kind of like a slap in the face. They were doing a ton of the fighting and a ton of the dying, and we didn't come and help them out in Europe. And so that contributes to a lot of negative feelings between the two of us. The other thing going on here is that is sort of the economic factor during World War II. During World War II, the United States had extended Lend-Lease aid, so essentially providing military assistance and other types of assistance to our allies during the war. And other than Great Britain, actually, the Soviet Union was the second largest recipient of that Lend-Lease aid. They got tons of stuff. They got planes, they got vehicles, they got, Jeeps, they got food, they got all sorts of stuff from us. And it really was the United States, industrial capabilities that had allowed the war to be sustained and also allowed the war to be won. And so there's that kind of disconnect. Yes, the Soviet Union had done a lot of the fighting and dying, but yes, the United States had done a lot of the industrial support for the war. And so we both feel at odds with each other because we each feel like we've done a lot of work and we sort of deserve to be recognized for that work to some extent. The other thing that's going on is that as the war starts to wind down, Stalin basically requests a very large loan of money from the United States. The Soviet Union is in a lot of destruction when World War II has ended because, again, the war has been fought in Europe, and the United States isn't dealing with any of those repercussions. The war wasn't fought on American soil, so we're doing okay, sort of physically at least, whereas the Soviet Union is not. So Stalin requests a large loan from the U.S. to rebuild the Soviet Union, about $6 billion. And the president by this point was Harry Truman, because Franklin Roosevelt had died. And Truman was not very trusting of Stalin. And he's sort of realizing as the war is ending, like, we don't really need you anymore. Once this war is over, like, what's the purpose of having a friendship or a relationship, really? And so he essentially like denied Stalin's request for a loan. And so this also contributes to a lot of negative feeling between the two. Another thing that's going on sort of before this point even has to do with what happens at the Yalta Conference. In the Yalta Conference, we had Winston Churchill, the American president at the time, Franklin Roosevelt, although as you can kind of tell, he is not looking so good. He looks pretty thin. He looks pretty like gaunt, frail. He ends up dying in April of 1945. He was quite sick. So you can kind of tell, unfortunately, that he's sort of on his last legs here. And then Joseph Stalin. And one of the things that they had agreed upon at the Yalta Conference was the Declaration of Liberated Europe. Basically, they all wanted to make sure that when the war was over, countries in Europe would have the abilities to elect their own leaders and have sort of self-determination. Churchill and Roosevelt were really worried about Stalin's presence, especially in Eastern Europe. They were worried he was going to force a communist pro-Soviet system in places in Eastern Europe. And Stalin, at the Yalta Conference at least, agreed, yes, let's have this Declaration of Liberated Europe. Yes, let's let European countries choose their own governments. But what ends up happening is not that. And again, this contributes to a lot of tension and distrust between the two of them. During World War II, the Soviet Union obviously had been fighting on the Eastern Front over here. Sorry, I know the little pointer is red and the map is also red and it's kind of hard to see, but that's okay. And so as the Soviet Union had pushed the Nazis out of Eastern Europe and they'd moved their way towards Germany and eventually, captured Berlin, as they'd been pushing their way through Eastern Europe, they'd also been occupying each of these areas. They'd been setting up their own troops here so that they could essentially set up pro-Soviet communist governments here. And that's exactly what they did. So Stalin essentially violates the Declaration of Liberated Europe by setting up governments in most of Eastern Europe that are not governments of the people's choice. They are not democratic governments. They are communist, totalitarian regimes that operate very similarly to the way that things were going within Russia. The other thing that takes place at the Yalta Conference that ends up causing a lot of issue is the division of Germany. So at the Yalta Conference, the Grand Alliance, the British, the Americans, and the Soviets, had been faced with the question of what do you do about Germany? I mean, this is a country that now, not once, but twice, has been involved in a world war. And the big issue is like, well, what do we do with them now? The decision that they made at the Yalta Conference was to take Germany and basically split it into 4 zones, and each of the major allied powers would be assigned a zone. And in their assigned zone, they had to essentially help rebuild it, like physically rebuild it, because a lot of Germany had been bombed due to saturated bombing through the British and the Americans. So they had to help physically rebuild it, but also politically sort of rebuild it. What ends up happening is that the British, the French, and the American zones will be consolidated into one zone known as Western Germany, whereas the Soviets, who are pretty much the odd man out here, their zone becomes known as Eastern Germany. And the fact that Germany is divided like this creates a lot of tension because the two zones are just so different from each other. In Western Germany, you have a democratic system, you have capitalism. In the Eastern zone, you have absolutely the opposite. And so that has a lot of negative repercussions and contributes to this sense of competition between the US and the Soviet Union. Another complicating factor is what to do with the city of Berlin. Berlin is the capital of Germany, but unfortunately it's inside the Soviet zone. So what they decided to do to make it fair, and this just feels so complicated to me at least, is to take the city of Berlin and also split it into 4 zones. And again, the same thing that happened with Germany as a whole plays out again in Berlin, that the American, French, and British zones of Berlin consolidate together to become Western Berlin. that have sort of capitalist ties. And the other part of Berlin, the Soviet zone, is Eastern Berlin, which is a communist government and part of the larger sort of communist or Soviet Union's system. So that creates a lot of issue that comes to a head in 1949. And this is the moment, I think this is like really the first action of the Cold War. This is the moment when people are, it's clear to people that, like, okay, this is going to be something that's going to be a really big issue between the two superpowers, that they're not going to be able to overlook it. The American, the French, and the British zones in 1949 were preparing to consolidate into one, Western German state. And what the British, the French, and the Americans were planning on doing was they were planning on essentially issuing a new currency to help restabilize the economic situation in their zones. But they didn't tell the Soviet Union that they were planning on doing this. And this change was essentially going to make the money in Western Germany, like the physical currency in Western Germany, a lot more valuable than the currency in Eastern Germany. And it was going to create an imbalance, essentially, of power. So the Russians are pretty upset by this, and what they decide to do is they lock down all of Berlin, and they prevent Western Berlin. I'm going to go back one slide here, if I can. Here we go. They prevent Western Berlin from being able to access anything. So they're able to do this, of course, because Berlin is in the Soviet zone. So they essentially just like blockade it. Like they physically put blockades all around Western Berlin so that trains and trucks cannot get in from West Germany into West Berlin to deliver supplies. And so this is the Soviets' way to sort of retaliate for the change in currency and what they see as like the Americans trying to pull the rug out from under them. This does not go well because the West Berliners are essentially cut off from everything, from medical supplies, from food, and no one can really get in except they can get in through the air. And so what the Americans and the British start doing is they start this massive year-long airlift where basically they are flying planes from West Germany into West Berlin, and a plane is landing like every, it's insane. There's like planes landing, more than one plane per hour is landing and then taking off, and every plane is bringing supplies, gasoline and medication and coal and food and clothing and all these sorts of things that the West Berliners need to survive for over a year. The Berlin blockade and the airlift proved a couple of things. Number one, they proved that this conflict was going to be a real conflict, that both the Soviet Union and the United States were not going to be backing down in this conflict. But number two, it also proved, and I think in some senses showed the world that there were good guys and bad guys. This airlift really painted the Americans and their allies as the good guys, right? They're going to fly these supplies into Berlin. They're not going to give up on these West Berliners. They're going to save them. And the Soviets really look like the bad guys to the rest of the world. I mean, they're cutting these people off from, life-needed supplies. And so it kind of created a clear, I think, dichotomy in the world. The next reason we can talk about why the Cold War starts when it did has to do with the Potsdam Conference. So the Potsdam Conference takes place in July of 1945. Winston Churchill is there, although he is replaced mid-conference by his successor, Clement Attlee. So that's a whole deal. There's a new American president, that's Harry Truman, because Franklin Roosevelt has died. And then, of course, there's Joseph Stalin. So this conference is taking place in July of 1945. What that means is that the war in Europe is over. VE Day was in May. The victory in Europe, that whole situation is done, but Japan is still fighting. And so this conference is really a question of how do we address the war with Japan? So it was at this conference, actually, that President Truman gets a phone call. And on that phone call, it is from the scientists on the Manhattan Project. And they essentially call him and they tell him, good news, we tested the first atomic bomb. It worked. It blew up. It was huge. This is going to be a weapon that we can use. And so Truman is very happy because what he knows now is that the United States has a huge advantage. The United States is going to be able to end the war, get that unconditional surrender that they had wanted from Japan, and we're going to be able to end the war sort of on our terms. This is going to be really an American win. So Truman tells to Stalin, look, I've got some good news. We've got a new weapon. I think the war will be over soon. He's very vague about it intentionally because the Soviets, this is like a top secret program. The Manhattan Project is top secret. He doesn't want Stalin to know exactly, but he does, want to flex on him a little. And Stalin just says, okay, great. That's great news. I'm glad to hear that. Stalin, though, knows. Stalin knows that the United States has been developing an atomic weapon because Stalin has spies inside the Manhattan Project. So now Stalin knows that we have an atomic bomb. Stalin also knows that Truman knows we have an atomic bomb. And Stalin also knows that Truman isn't telling him. And so that breeds a lot of distrust between the two of them, especially on Stalin's part, because he realizes he's not being told the truth by someone who really should be considered sort of his equal in a lot of ways. So what this ends up leading to, and why, again, this becomes such a big issue, why the Cold War becomes such a big issue, is because now the nuclear arms race begins. Once the United States uses that first atomic bomb against Japan, then the Soviet Union immediately, they're already going into overdrive trying to create their own atomic weapon because they don't want the Americans to be the only ones with atomic weapons. So this kicks off a huge sort of moment in the 50s, especially into the 60s, where the Soviet Union and the United States are both sort of racing to develop the best new type of nuclear capabilities. So after the atomic bomb, then they start developing the hydrogen bomb, which is even bigger. After that, they start working on like nuclear tipped missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, all this kind of stuff, basically more and more destructive weapons. And so that really fuels this sense of competition and rivalry between the two of them. The last thing I'm going to talk about for today about why the Cold War started when it did has to do a little bit with the structure of the United Nations. So the UN is basically the League of Nations 2.0. It's a lot more effective of an organization because it has a military force. It has a lot more sort of independent branches that do a lot of great things. It's a great organization. But during the time of the Cold War, the structure of the UN also provided a platform for the United States and the Soviet Union to constantly sort of be in competition. So what I mean by that is this, and you can also check out this video, here it is, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about how the UN works. So the UN has two parts, the General Assembly and the Security Council. The General Assembly is representatives from all of the member nations. You've probably seen photos of this, of the General Assembly. It's like a huge room, people sitting at different desks. They have their little like placards on their desk with their name and their country. So that's one part. The job of the General Assembly is to propose bills and vote on them. But they don't actually have like the real power. Once they propose a bill and vote on it, if it passes, it moves to the next phase or the next part of the United Nations, which is the Security Council. The Security Council, these are the people who actually would like approve or veto a bill. And if they approve it, it goes into action. The Security Council has 15 seats on it. Of those 15 seats, 10 of them are temporary seats, meaning that different countries every 2 years, the seats switch. So like if South Africa is on the Security Council in 2018, in 2020, a different country gets to sit in the seat and have their turn on the Security Council. So it's like fair for everyone. But on the Security Council, there are 5 permanent seats, and those permanent seats belong to the United States, Great Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union. And being on the Security Council means that you have veto power. Essentially, if a bill comes to the Security Council, just one of those members can veto it. They can say, nope, and then the bill is done. There's no way to overturn a veto. Like, it just doesn't happen. And so, as you might be able to predict, having the United States and the Soviet Union both as permanent members on the Security Council, they basically just end up vetoing each other back and forth as a way to flex on the other. The graph you can see down here is a graph of Security Council vetoes. And just no surprise at all, the U.S. and the Soviet Union have the most vetoes out of all of the permanent members. And a vast majority of those vetoes are taking place during the years of the Cold War. If you're interested in this more, this is a link that will take you to the UN website. and it gives you the veto history, so you can like look back at the Cold War years and see, you know, what they were vetoing on. One example is Greece. The country of Greece wanted to apply to be a member of the UN, but Greece is an American ally, and of course the Soviets immediately vetoed that. Greece has to like keep trying to apply over and over and over. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. So the United Nations, while it is a great organization, because it is founded in 1945, when World War II ends, it becomes a platform for the US and the Soviet Union to essentially constantly disagree and constantly, you know, flex on each other. So that's all I'm going to talk about in this first video. In the second video, I'll be talking about some of the main policies or ideologies during the time of the Cold War, or at least during the first half of the Cold War between 1945 and 1965, and we'll also briefly touch on the alliances. So that's it for right now. Thanks for listening, and I will chat with you on the next video.